Ruth lost everything. Then God opened a door she never expected. Ruth did not lose one thing. She lost the house that had learned her footsteps. She lost the voice that used to answer from another room. She lost the future people probably assumed she would have: a husband, children, a name protected by a family, a place at the table that did not have to be explained. And then the morning still came. That is one of the cruelest parts of loss. The world does not stop long enough to honor what disappeared. A clay cup still waits near the fire. A doorway still opens to the same road. People still need food. Someone still has to decide what happens next, even when the heart has no strength to imagine a next. The book of Ruth begins there. Not with romance, not with harvest music, not with Boaz standing in a golden field. It begins with funerals, emptied rooms, and 3 widows standing on a road out of Moab. Before God opens a door Ruth never expected, He lets us see how closed her life appears. That matters because many people think an open door from God will feel bright, obvious, and emotionally clean. But in Ruth's story, the door did not first look like opportunity. It looked like survival. It looked like loyalty when leaving would have been easier. It looked like bending low at the edge of someone else's field, gathering leftovers with tired hands. Ruth does not chase a destiny. She walks faithfully through grief. And the deeper question is not simply how Ruth found a new life. The deeper question is this: how does God open a future for someone who has almost no visible future left? The house of bread became a house of absence. The story begins with a famine in Bethlehem. That detail should trouble us. Bethlehem means house of bread, but the house of bread has no bread. A man named Elimelech takes his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and leaves Judah for the land of Moab. The Bible does not tell us every emotion packed into that decision. It only tells us enough to feel the pressure. Hunger was strong enough to make a family leave the place they knew. They were not trying to build a glamorous new life. They were trying to stay alive. But Moab does not become the refuge they hoped for. Elimelech dies. Naomi becomes a widow in a foreign land. Her sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, and for 10 years life continues. That sentence can pass quickly when we read it, but 10 years is not a small pause. 10 years is enough time for routines to form, enough time for Ruth to know the sound of Naomi's voice in the morning, enough time for ordinary affection to grow between women who were not born into the same people but had somehow become family. Then Mahlon and Chilion die too. Now 3 women remain where a household used to be. No husband, no sons, no children, no secure future. Loss does not only remove people, it rearranges the meaning of every object around you. The sleeping mat is still there, but the person is not. The doorway still opens, but no familiar shadow enters through it. The meal is smaller. The silence is larger. Even the air in the room feels as if it has learned the names of the dead. Ruth's grief was not abstract. It had weight. It had social consequences. In the ancient world, a widow without children could become frighteningly vulnerable. Security was tied to family, land, inheritance, and male protection. Ruth had lost her husband, but she had also lost the structure that made tomorrow feel possible. This is why Ruth's story should never be reduced to a woman who met Boaz. Before Ruth meets Boaz, she is a Moabite widow with no clear place in Israel's future. She is not standing in a romantic beginning. She is standing near the edge of disappearance. Naomi hears that the Lord has visited his people and given them food. Bread has returned to Bethlehem. That sounds like good news, but good news can feel complicated when it arrives after graves have already been dug. Bread in Bethlehem does not bring Naomi's husband back. It does not raise her sons. It does not erase the years in Moab. I have learned that grief can make provision feel almost offensive at first. You hear that something is improving somewhere, but inside you think, too late, the thing I needed most is already gone. That is not a lack of faith. Sometimes it is just the honest sound of a heart still standing beside what it buried. So Naomi begins the journey home. But she does not walk like a woman who sees a door opening. She walks like a woman carrying the remains of a life she can no longer repair. And Ruth walks with her. That is where the first hidden movement begins. Not in a field, not at a city gate, not in a marriage proposal. It begins on a road where grief is still fresh and no one yet knows that loyalty is about to become the first doorway. Ruth's first open door was the choice to stay. Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah to go back. There is no bitterness in the command. There is pain, but also mercy. Naomi looks at these two young women and sees what she cannot give them. No sons, no security, no easy future in Bethlehem. She tells them to return to their mother's houses, to seek rest, to remarry, to live. Naomi does not see herself as someone who can carry blessing. She sees herself as an empty road. I think broken people often do that. They assume their sorrow makes them useless. They look at what they cannot provide and forget that God can still place mercy beside them, through them, even while they are still bleeding. Orpah weeps and kisses Naomi goodbye. The text does not condemn her. She does what Naomi has urged her to do. She returns toward the familiar, toward the place where she may still have a recognizable future. But Ruth clings. That word matters. Ruth does not politely linger. She attaches herself to Naomi with a covenant kind of loyalty. She refuses to let Naomi's sorrow travel alone. Then she speaks words that have been repeated at weddings for generations, though the original scene is not soft with flowers or music. Where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Ruth 1:16. Those words are beautiful, but they are not sentimental. Ruth is standing on a road after death. Her future is not secure. She is not choosing comfort. She is choosing uncertainty with faithfulness inside it. She is choosing to become the foreign woman in another people's town. She is choosing a God she did not grow up naming as her own. She is choosing to walk into Bethlehem, where some people may see her first as Moabite before they ever see her as loyal. She is choosing a mother-in-law who has nothing visible left to offer. That is not romantic devotion. That is holy courage. Ruth's first open door was not Boaz. It was not marriage. It was not barley. It was the decision to stay faithful when leaving would have made more practical sense. There is a kind of obedience that does not look useful while you are doing it. You tell the truth, and no reward appears. You love someone who cannot repay you. You keep showing up for a person whose grief makes them hard to comfort. You follow God into a future that gives you no receipt, no guarantee, no emotional proof that things will turn out beautifully. That is where Ruth stands. And this is where her story quietly corrects a shallow version of open doors. We often think God's doors are found by chasing visible opportunity. Ruth shows us that sometimes God's door is hidden inside covenant love, a faithful yes, a refusal to abandon, a decision made before the outcome can be measured. The Hebrew idea behind this kind of loyal love is often called hesed, steadfast love, covenant kindness, mercy that does not leave when leaving is possible. And in this story, the person who displays hesed most clearly at first is Ruth, the outsider. That is stunning. A Moabite widow becomes a living picture of covenant love to an Israelite woman too wounded to recognize hope. Ruth does not know that her words on the road will echo into redemptive history. She does not know that her name will later appear in the genealogy of Christ. She only knows Naomi is walking toward Bethlehem with an emptied heart, and she will not let her walk alone. Sometimes the future God opens begins with that kind of small, costly faithfulness. Not a breakthrough, a staying. And when Ruth and Naomi finally reach Bethlehem, the town notices the woman who has returned. But the real surprise is the woman standing beside her. Naomi came home empty, but mercy was standing beside her. When Naomi enters Bethlehem, the whole town is stirred. The women ask, "Is this Naomi?" It is a question filled with recognition and shock. Grief has changed her face. Time has taken something from her posture. She left with a husband and sons. She returns with sorrow and a Moabite daughter-in-law beside her. Naomi answers with one of the rawest sentences in the story. "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Ruth 1:20. Naomi means pleasant, Mara means bitter. She is not trying to sound victorious. She is telling the truth as she can see it. She says she went away full, and the Lord brought her back empty. That sentence is honest, but it is not complete, because Ruth is standing right there. This is one of the most human details in the book. Naomi's grief is so loud that she cannot yet recognize the mercy still walking beside her. She is not pretending. Her husband is gone. Her sons are gone. The life she knew has collapsed. But the word empty does not fully account for Ruth. Grief can narrow the eye until absence becomes the only thing we can see. I know that feeling. Sometimes one loss becomes so large that every remaining gift looks small beside it. Someone can sit near you, love you, help you breathe through the next day, and still the heart says, "I have nothing." Not because that person means nothing, but because pain has swallowed the room. The Bible does not shame Naomi for speaking from that place. It lets her lament. That matters. God is not frightened by unpolished grief. Ruth's story gives space for a wounded woman to say what life feels like before she understands what God is doing. But the reader is allowed to see more than Naomi sees. Naomi says empty. We see Ruth. And Ruth enters Bethlehem as a stranger. Naomi is returning to a town that knows her story. Ruth is entering a town that knows her category. Again and again, she is called Ruth the Moabite. Her loyalty is real, but her foreignness follows her. She has left Moab, but Moab has not disappeared from how others identify her. That detail should not be softened. Ruth's path into God's unexpected door includes the vulnerability of being an outsider. She does not walk into Bethlehem with instant acceptance. She walks in with a complicated identity, limited protection, and a daily need for food. Then Ruth asks to glean. Gleaning was God's provision for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. Israel's law commanded landowners not to harvest every corner of their fields. They were to leave the edges for those who had no land of their own. Long before Ruth bent down in a barley field, God had already written mercy into the margins of the harvest. That is easy to miss. The edge of the field was not an accident. It was compassion built into the life of God's people. Ruth does not go out looking for destiny. She goes out looking for enough grain to keep Naomi and herself alive. There is humility in that. She has to bend low. She has to gather what others leave. She has to depend on the obedience of people who may not care about God's law or her survival. Her back would ache before the day was over. Dust would cling to her clothing. Every unfamiliar voice might make her wonder whether she would be welcomed or sent away. This is not a woman stepping confidently into a blessing. This is a woman doing what love requires because someone has to eat. And yet the place of humility becomes the place of hidden direction. The door God prepared for Ruth is not in the center of the field at first. It is at the edge, among the leftovers, in the place where she is only trying to survive. That is where the story begins to turn. The field looked accidental, but God was already there. Ruth goes out to glean, and the narrator gives us one of the quietest miracles in Scripture. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, Ruth 2:3. She happened. The phrase almost feels casual. From Ruth's point of view, that may be exactly how it felt. She did not wake up with a map from heaven. She did not hear a voice telling her which boundary line to cross. She did not know the name Boaz would soon matter. She simply stepped into the day with need in her stomach and responsibility in her hands. But the story lets us see what Ruth cannot see yet. What looks like accident is being held inside providence. This is not superstition. It is not a secret code reading of every random event. It is the biblical vision of a God who can guide ordinary feet into prepared places without announcing the plan ahead of time. That is deeply comforting because most of our lives are not lived in dramatic spiritual moments. Most of our lives are lived in necessary steps. We go to work, we make the call, we care for someone tired, we fill out the form, we answer the message, we return to the same room and do the next honest thing. We think we are only gathering enough for today. But sometimes God hides a doorway inside the task you thought was merely survival. Boaz enters the field and greets the workers with blessing. "The Lord be with you," they answer. "The Lord bless you." This small exchange tells us something important. Boaz is not only wealthy, his field has an atmosphere shaped by reverence. Work and worship are not separated in his mouth. Then Boaz notices Ruth. He asks, "Whose young woman is this?" That question carries the world Ruth has lost. In that culture, a person's security was tied to belonging. Whose daughter, whose wife, whose household, whose land? Ruth has lost the usual answers. She has Naomi, but she has no husband, no son, no property, and no obvious claim to protection. The servant identifies her as the Moabite woman who returned with Naomi, but he also describes her labor. She asked permission. She worked steadily from morning until now. Ruth's character has been speaking in the field before she has any conversation with Boaz. Then Boaz does something powerful. He uses authority to create safety. He tells Ruth not to glean in another field. He tells her to stay near his young women. He commands the young men not to touch her. He gives her access to water already drawn by his workers. This is godly strength. It does not merely admire vulnerability from a distance. It changes the environment so the vulnerable can breathe. Boaz does not make Ruth beg twice. He does not treat her foreignness as contamination. He does not turn her need into humiliation. He sees her, protects her, and honors the loyalty she has shown Naomi. Ruth falls on her face and asks why she has found favor, since she is a foreigner. That question is not small. It is the question of someone who has learned not to assume kindness is coming. "Why would you see me?" Boaz answers by naming what has been reported, how Ruth left father, mother, and native land to come to a people she did not know. Then he says, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2:12. Under whose wings? That image changes everything. Ruth is not only standing in Boaz's field, she is being gathered under the shelter of Israel's God. The barley is mercy. The water is mercy. The protection is mercy. The field that seemed random is becoming a sanctuary with stalks of grain underfoot. Ruth went out looking for food. God was bringing her under wings, and when she carries the grain back to Naomi, the older woman begins to see that the story may not be as empty as she thought. The door opened through redemption, not a shortcut. Ruth comes home with far more grain than Naomi expected. Something has happened. Naomi can see it in Ruth's hands. The amount is too generous to be ordinary. For the first time, the bitterness in Naomi's voice begins to loosen. She asks where Ruth gleaned, and Ruth says the man's name is Boaz. Naomi hears that name and recognizes what Ruth could not have known. Boaz is a close relative, a redeemer. This is where the story moves from kindness to covenant responsibility. In Israel, a redeemer was not simply a generous man. The kinsman redeemer, or Goel, could act to preserve family inheritance, restore what was at risk of being lost, and protect the future of a vulnerable household. Redemption was not an emotion, it was action with cost. That is important because Ruth's story is not teaching us to wait passively until someone powerful notices us. It is showing us how God's mercy works through faithful people, righteous structures, and costly obedience. Naomi sees a possibility. She gives Ruth instructions for the threshing floor. To modern ears, the scene can feel strange. Ruth goes at night, After Boaz has eaten and lain down, she uncovers his feet and waits. This is not a cheap romantic scene. It is risky. Ruth carries more than instructions into that night. She carries the possibility of being misunderstood. She carries the vulnerability of a foreign widow making a bold request. She carries the fear that Boaz might reject her, or worse, fail to protect her dignity. Imagine the darkness of the threshing floor, the smell of grain, the quiet breathing of workers nearby, the cool air on Ruth's hands as she waits beside the place where one answer could change everything, or leave her more exposed than before. When Boaz wakes and asks who she is, Ruth says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Ruth 3:9. That sentence is one of the great turns in the book. Earlier, Boaz blessed Ruth under the wings of the Lord. Now Ruth asks Boaz to become the human expression of that shelter. She is not replacing God with a man. She is asking a righteous man to embody the covenant mercy he has already spoken over her. True redemption must become more than a blessing spoken at a distance. It must take responsibility. Boaz responds with honor. He does not exploit the moment. He does not shame Ruth. He praises her character, protects her reputation, and sends her home with grain. But he also tells the truth. There is another redeemer closer than he is. That detail matters. Boaz cannot simply seize the outcome because it feels emotionally right. He must handle the matter in the light. He goes to the town gate, where legal decisions are made. He speaks before witnesses. He presents the matter clearly. The nearer Redeemer first shows interest in the land, but when Ruth and the duty to raise up the dead man's name are included, he refuses. Then Boaz steps forward. The door opens, but not through manipulation, not through secrecy, not through forcing the blessing. It opens through righteousness. That may be one of the most needed truths in Ruth's story. God's doors can withstand the light. If a door requires deception to open, if it requires you to hide, compromise, seduce, exaggerate, or betray your conscience, it may not be the door God prepared. Ruth's door opens at the gate, before witnesses, through a redeemer willing to carry the cost. And this is where the story becomes larger than Ruth's personal restoration. Boaz does not merely make Ruth feel seen, he gives her a future within covenant faithfulness. He protects Naomi's family line. He preserves a name that death seemed to have erased. Redemption does not pretend the loss never happened. It gives the story a future beyond the loss. Ruth lost a husband in Moab. Through Boaz, God opens a way for fruitfulness in Bethlehem. But even then, no one standing at that gate can see how far this mercy will reach. The baby in Naomi's arms was a door into a larger story. The book of Ruth ends with a child. Ruth and Boaz marry. The Lord gives conception. Ruth bears a son. The women of Bethlehem gather around Naomi and bless the Lord, saying he has not left her without a redeemer. The camera of the story, if we can say it that way, turns back to Naomi. The woman who returned saying, "I am empty," now holds a child in her arms. The town that heard her bitterness now witnesses a mercy she could not have imagined on the road from Moab. Her grief was real. Her losses were real. But emptiness did not get to write the final sentence. Still, the women say something even more surprising about Ruth, that Naomi's daughter-in-law, who loves her, is more to her than 7 sons. In that world, sons meant security, inheritance, family continuation. To say Ruth is better than 7 sons is not casual praise, it is a holy reversal. The Moabite widow, the outsider, the woman with no obvious future, becomes the one through whom Naomi's household is restored. The woman Naomi could not fully see when she said empty has become the visible evidence of God's kindness. The child is named Obed. He becomes the father of Jesse, the father of David. That final genealogy changes the whole scale of the book. For most of the story, everything has been small. A road, a vow, a field, a handful of grain. A conversation at night, a legal exchange at the gate, a baby placed in an older woman's arms. But the ending reveals that these small things were connected to the royal line of Israel, and later, in Matthew 1, Ruth's name appears in the genealogy of Jesus. That is the astonishing wideness of God's door. Ruth did not merely find a new home. She was woven into the line of the Messiah. The woman who once had no son became part of the line through which the son would come. The widow with no visible future was carried into the future of redemption itself. We have to be careful here. Ruth is not a formula. Her story does not promise that every faithful sufferer will receive marriage, children, public honor, or the exact earthly restoration they long for. Scripture is more honest than that. Some grief remains grief. Some losses are not replaced in the same form. Some faithful people carry unanswered aches for a long time. But Ruth does reveal something deeper than a formula. God is able to bring redemptive future out of places that appear emptied beyond repair. He can work through an aging widow who calls herself bitter, through a Moabite woman others may see as an outsider, through the corners of a field, through a righteous man who uses power to protect, through a public gate, through a child whose significance will not be fully understood for generations. Naomi did not live to see Jesus born in Bethlehem. Ruth did not open Matthew's Gospel and find her name. Boaz did not stand beside the manger, but their faithful choices mattered in a story larger than their own sight. That may be one of the deepest comforts in the book. God's door may be bigger than your ability to measure it. You may think He is helping you survive this week, while He is also planting mercy that will outlive you. You may think you are only gathering enough grain for today, while He is weaving something into a future you cannot yet imagine. Ruth came under the wings of Israel's God. Through her line, the nations would one day be invited under those wings too. The door hidden in the leftovers. Ruth did not know the field was a doorway when she stepped into it. She only knew Naomi needed food. She only knew the sun was rising. Her hands were empty, and somebody had to bend low enough to gather what the harvesters left behind. There was no music over the moment, no sign hanging in the air that said, "This is where your future begins." Just dust. Just barley, just the next faithful thing. That is how God's mercy often comes to us, not always through the large door we keep staring at, but through the small obedience we almost overlook. A field edge, a hard conversation, a humble return, a choice to stay loyal when the easier thing is to disappear. A willingness to receive kindness without suspicion when grief has trained us to expect disappointment. Before you try to force the next door, bend down to the faithfulness in front of you. The place may look too small to matter. It may look like leftovers. It may look like survival, not destiny. But Ruth teaches us that God can hide a doorway in the very place where you were only trying to make it through the day. So do not despise the edge of the field. Do not despise the quiet task. Do not despise the road that began with tears. Loss may have changed what is behind you, but it has not emptied God's ability to prepare what is ahead of you. The same God who saw Ruth in Moab, on the road, in the field, at the threshing floor, and in the family line of Christ, is still able to guide a life that feels reduced to fragments. If Ruth's story speaks to the season you are living, write this in the comments: Lord, lead me to the door you prepared. Not the door I can force, not the door I can predict, the door you prepared. And then take the next faithful step. Even if it feels small, even if your hands are tired, even if all you can see right now is the edge of the field. Because sometimes the door God opens begins exactly there.